Hello and welcome to this tutorial where we're going to build a full text search on entities, or rather on tables as you prefer. We're going to build a simple Quarkus application with a simple domain model, and we're going to persist the model into a Postgres database and also provide a REST endpoint to read data from the database. Therefore, I'm going to build a Quarkus application, so just check out quarkus.io and follow the get started link. They provide a list of recommendations what you should have or need to have. So make sure you have an IDE ready, JDK 8 or newer, and Maven or Gradle. I'm going to use IntelliJ, the community edition. I'm going to use JDK version 15 because I had some problem with newer versions. And I'm going to use Maven because Gradle support is still somewhat experimental in Quarkus. Then you can scroll down and follow that link to be guided through the first application. I'm gonna ignore most of it and directly jump into this Bootstrap section. And you can copy over this command given here. I'm gonna customize it a bit because I want to have a different group ID and a different project name. But basically you can just copy this one over. When you run the command for the first time, it will download a bunch of stuff, so it might take some seconds. I already did that, so it's pretty fast. And it comes with a success message and also some instructions how you can boot up the application. So just change into the directory, run this Maven command, and then open localhost 8080, and you should already see the welcome page. I'm going to skip that and instead bring up IntelliJ. I will use some shortcuts in IntelliJ, so you can see them here in the middle. So just make sure to have an eye on that. Before we take a look at the code, let's first have a look at the POM file. And it comes already with a bunch of useful defaults. I'm just going to change this one to Java version 15. And I will add some dependencies that will come in handy in a moment. JSON is helpful because I want my REST endpoint to return JSON documents. And when you're interested in more details, just follow the link that I always put on top of each dependency, which will guide you to the Quarkus guides. And there you find very good explanation. In general, the Quarkus documentation is really good and I can really recommend it. Also, I'm gonna need Postgres driver. And I want to write some repositories in the Spring style. So I'm gonna add the Spring JPA dependency. And don't forget to reload the Maven dependencies so that IntelliJ is aware of what we just added. Let's have a look at the default code. And as you can see, by default, it only creates a REST endpoint, and we can directly check out that this is working. Therefore, I'm going to use a plugin. As you can see, I have two plugins for Quarkus. One is the official one from Red Hat, and one is Quarkus Run Config. And what this basically enables is that you can start the Quarkus application in dev mode, even so that we don't have any main method. Just make sure that you have both of them installed. Then bring up the run configuration, and the plugin will create these two entries. So I'm select the one for Maven, give it a name, whatever you like, point it to the project, and define your JDK. And you can directly start to debug the application. That looks pretty good. It prints out the localhost endpoint. And as you can see, this is the default welcome page, which links to a lot of resources. So I highly recommend that you check it out. I'm going to ignore most of that, and I'm only interested in this REST endpoint. So I'm going to open this, and you can see it returns hello REST easy. And this is exactly what we see here. We can also modify that string a bit, like adding some dots. And when I change back to the browser and refresh, the change is directly reflected. So what happens behind the scene is that Quarkus comes with some hot reloading. So it just stopped the application, recompiled the change, and started again. And that all in a little bit less than a second. Let's create our basic setup. Therefore, I'm going to create some packages. First one will be our main app. That would be basically where our REST endpoints are and where you would have your business logic. Also, we will have a search app. This could be an own Quarkus application, but for a simpler setup, I'm just gonna add it into this one. And we will have a common part, which basically will contain our entities and a way to retrieve them. So this part will be shared between the main app and the search app. You could also create an own Maven module for that. As I just said, we will have an entity package, and I'm also going to create a repository. This will basically contain a way to retrieve our entities from the database. So first I'm going to create the domain models, and I want to use a really simple model with an author entity that has a relation to some book entities. Let's start with the books. And each book will have a name, or a title to be more precise. And I'm also going to add an ISBN, which is basically a standard to identify bookings. Make sure you have getters and setters for both. And that's it basically for the book already. So next will be the author. The author will have a name and a relation to the books. And I'm gonna add a constructor which takes both arguments, and I'm also gonna add a constructor for both arguments in the book. So let's have our author resource return the books. I'm just gonna move that over into the main app. And I want that this one now returns an author with 2 books, just so that we can make sure that our REST endpoint is working. And let's have a second book and add both of them to an author. Change the return type to author, and also change the return type here to author. And make sure that you change the return type to JSON. And when we check now in the browser, we can see our beautiful domain model. We have an author with a name, and the author contains a list of books. So next I want to persist this simple model into the database. And therefore I'm first going to extend the Java classes and then bring up a Postgres database with Docker. So since every entity needs an ID, I'm going to create a new abstract entity, which then the entity classes will inherit from. So this will be a mapped superclass, and it only contains the ID. And now the author will extend it. And it also needs some meta information like the entity annotation, and also make sure that you add an empty constructor because JPA will need one, otherwise you get an error from Hibernate. Let's quickly do the same for the book. Again, make sure that you have the empty default constructor Since the author is in relation to the books, it will also need some annotation here. So I'm going to add the one-to-many and also have it a join column, because otherwise Hibernate would create an additional table which contains the IDs from the books to the author. The cascade all is required because I want to persist an author together with its books, and without that I would always have to persist the books before I can add them to the author and then persist the author. Next, we're gonna create a repository to read and write from the database. This interface will simply extend an interface from Spring Data JPA. That's it already. And to have some actual content in the database, I'm also going to create a seeder class. I want that Quarkus insert an author with some books at every app restart, so we have some data to play around with. So I'm going to make this application scope so it's managed by the Quarkus dependency injection. And I will need the author repository that I just created. And to execute code on every start, you can add an onStart method. And with this annotation observes and the startup event, Quarkus will make sure that in every app start and on every hot reload, that it will execute whatever code we write inside of this. So I will just copy over this build method from our resource, paste it in here, and use the repository class to actually persist our author. I'm going to reuse the repository in the resource, and we'll use it here to load the author from the database. So the next step is to create our actual Postgres database. I will use Docker Compose for that. And we will have later multiple services, but at the moment it's only the Postgres database. Most important part is here you have to define an environment variable named Postgres password, which I set here to change me. All the other fields are kind of optional. Also make sure that you have the port mapped. So the last step is now to connect our application to this Postgres database we just created. Therefore, I'm going to go into the application properties. So this basically references the values from our Docker Compose file. You see the username and the password and the name of the database. This is all exactly as defined here. I also want that Quarkus on every start creates our table from scratch. So I'm going to add the drop create statement here, as you might know it from Hibernate. So let's bring up our Postgres database with Docker. And check in the browser that everything worked. And that looks pretty good. As you can see, all our entities have now an ID with a value created from our Postgres database. Besides that, it looks as before. To wrap it up, we created our basic Quarkus application with a REST endpoint that can return an author. We can read the author from the database, save it to the database, and we have a very clean domain model with the author that has a relation to the books, but the books don't have any relation back to the author, so they're not aware what their author is. And we have some technical helper like the abstract entity, which nicely hides away the technical stuff that would otherwise pollute our domain model. So in the next episode, we're gonna connect the database with Debezium to our Pulsar cluster and then read it back into our search app, which is so far empty. And from there, we can pump it to Elasticsearch and apply the full text search. So see you there.